Welcome to Haunted House, where the most terrifying, mysterious, and supernatural stories await you. If you want to hear the stories that will steal your sleep in the dead of night and make your heart race with thrill, then you've come to the right place. So, sit back, turn off the lights, and let's dive into the world of shadows, spirits, and unsolved mysteries. Title: The Prison of Ghosts, where the dead seek justice. It was late at night. A rugged jeep crawled up a winding mountain road, headlights cutting through the thick mist. On either side, only darkness stretched, occasionally interrupted by the eerie howling of foxes and the whispering of the forest. Inside the jeep sat investigative journalist Neil, with his cameraman Rahul beside him. They were on a mission to shoot a documentary on a long-abandoned prison, one soaked in blood and riddled with rumors. According to locals, even today, invisible inmates haunted its walls. "You're sure this place even exists?" Rahul asked, clutching his camera. Neil smiled faintly. From 1935 to 1942, this prison held political detainees. Many went missing. No case files, no records, just rumors that they never escaped, not even in death. Suddenly, the GPS announced, "You have reached your destination." But around them was nothing. No buildings, no gate, just a chilling fog and an unsettling silence. Then they noticed something. Lying in the middle of the road was a massive rusted lock, broken open as if someone had forced it off. Neil stepped out. "Where's the prison? It was supposed to be right here." Then, slowly, out of the swirling mist, something began to take shape. A giant iron gate. As if rising from the fog itself, a decaying stone archway emerged and etched into the iron. "Kalipahad Central Jail," Neil whispered. "It's real, but this wasn't supposed to be visible anymore." The gate creaked open on its own. They stepped in. The cold hit them instantly. A chilling wind sliced through their jackets. Ahead stretched a long corridor, lined with cells. A few rusted lamps flickered above, even though electricity had supposedly been cut off decades ago. "How are the lights working?" Rahul whispered. They walked slowly, one cell after another, empty. But on every wall, deep scratch marks, old dried blood, and scribbled words. "We are innocent. We want justice." This was no trial. This was execution. Neil's throat tightened. Rahul kept filming. Then they stopped at a particular cell. A rusted nameplate still clung to the bars. "Alamgir's cell." Neil froze. Alamgir, the revolutionary who vanished without a trace. Rahul nodded. "Didn't they say he killed himself?" "No," Neil replied softly. "They never found his body. They entered the cell." Suddenly, a cold breeze brushed past them, and in the far corner of the cell, a shadow sat hunched. It wasn't fully visible, but it was breathing. "Is this some setup?" Rahul whispered. The shadow slowly lifted its head. "You've come to ask, or to join us?" Neil didn't answer. The shadow stood up. At that moment, they heard metal clinks, dozens of cell locks across the corridor unlocking by themselves. One by one, dark figures stepped out from each cell. Some stared blankly. Others looked furious. Some trembled as if stuck in their final moments. "We want justice," one voice said. "We only asked for freedom." They lied. And now, no one listens. Neil turned to run, but the main gate slammed shut behind them. They were trapped. The spirits surrounded them. A woman's voice came from the shadows. "They didn't even let me see my child one last time. I still search these walls for his name." Another voice echoed. "They hanged me without trial. I just wanted to say I was innocent." Neil collapsed to his knees. His voice shook. I came to listen. I'll tell your story. I will fight for your justice." The spirits froze. The central figure stepped forward. "Alamgir, you'll carry our stories to the world? You'll make them remember the names they buried?" Neil nodded. "I promise." Then, all lights went out. Total darkness. Silence. And then, the lights blinked back on. Neil was standing outside, just beyond the main gate. The prison was gone. Only the mist, the mountain, and a ringing silence remained. Rahul stood beside him, but the camera was missing. Neil looked down. At his feet lay an old, dusty notebook. He opened it. Inside, pages and pages were filled with names, dates, charges, and the same message over and over. I was innocent. Neil looked up, face pale but resolute. This story, he would tell it. This documentary, he would make it. And this justice, he would fight for it. Neil didn't speak a word during the ride down the mountain. Rahul, equally shaken, stayed silent. The notebook rested between them, weathered, stained, and humming with something that still didn't feel entirely gone. By the time they reached the city, dawn was breaking. A pale light crept across the skyline, yet the chill of Kalapahad clung to Neil's skin like damp ash. They parted ways with barely a nod. Rahul needed time. Neil, though, couldn't stop. He spent the next few days poring through archives, old newspaper clippings, court records, declassified files. And strangely enough, the names from the notebook, all of them, were real. Real people. Real prisoners. Real disappearances. Each file told the same story. Revolutionary voices, arrested and silenced without trial, their existence scrubbed from public records. But now he had the truth, and he was going to tell it. He submitted his footage and notes to his editor, preparing for the documentary release. The night before it aired, he sat alone in his room, the notebook on his desk, a faint echo of whispers swirling in the back of his mind. Midnight. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Nothing. Just breathing. Then, a voice. Soft, distant, familiar. We are waiting for our justice. The line cut. The next morning, Neil's documentary aired online. Within hours, it went viral. People were captivated, not just by the history or the horror, but by the haunting realism of it all. The footage inside the prison, the whispering voices, the flickering lights, the rusted locks moving on their own, none of it felt staged. Comments poured in. Why does this feel too real? My grandfather was sent to a place like this. We never found his body. Chills. I saw a figure standing behind Neil at 1803. Did anyone else see that? I dreamt about this prison last night. I've never seen it before. One comment stood out. It was posted by a user named Alam1942. Thank you, Neil, for remembering us. Neil stared at it, heart pounding. He clicked on the profile. No photo. Joined the same day. No activity after that single post. He refreshed the page. The comment was gone. So was the account. That night, Neil couldn't sleep. He sat beside the notebook, flipping through pages he thought he'd already read. But now, something was different. A new name had appeared. His own. Neil Mukherjee, witness. He dropped the book. The room grew cold. He turned slowly toward the window. There, on the other side of the glass, stood a line of silent, translucent figures. Not angry, not vengeful, just watching. One of them, Alamgir, nodded once. Then they faded. A soft breeze fluttered the pages of the notebook, as though unseen fingers were writing something new. Justice has begun. From that day on, strange letters arrived at Neil's office. Accounts from families of those who vanished, documents lost decades ago, audio tapes, even confessions. It was as though the ghosts of Kalapahad had found their voice. Through him. And he knew. He could never stop now. Not until every name in that book was heard. Not until the prison of ghosts finally fell silent. Over the next few weeks, Neil's life took a strange turn. One that teetered between recognition and dread. The documentary, titled The Forgotten Prisoners of Kalapahad, wasn't just successful, it became a phenomenon. Universities invited him to speak. Human rights groups contacted him. Even a retired Supreme Court judge reached out to commend his work. But beneath all the applause, Neil felt something else. Something watching. He began to notice patterns. People who contacted him about similar prisons vanished. Emails he received from unknown sources, some with attachments of old prisoner logs, disappeared from his inbox moments after arriving. One night, his apartment door was left slightly open, even though he clearly remembered locking it. Inside, nothing was stolen. except the notebook. He searched every drawer, every shelf, every inch. Gone. He sat in silence for hours, heart pounding. Then at 3 a.m., a soft knock. Not at the door. At the window. He lived on the 6th floor. He didn't open it. Instead, he backed away, trembling. And then he heard it, a whisper through the glass, layered with many voices at once. "We are not all at peace yet." The next morning, Neil found a small package at his doorstep. No name, no address. Inside, the notebook. But its cover was different. It was newer, refreshed. And inside were pages he had never seen before. New names, new prisons, places across India, tucked in forest corners, buried under highways, hidden inside government buildings long abandoned. One stood out. Bhargava Detention Center, sealed since 1964. Location, Rajasthan, Aravalli Hills. There was no record of it online. No news stories. No government mention. But the notebook had floor plans, inmate sketches, and one chilling entry. "This is where the screamers were buried. They never stopped screaming. So we buried their tongues too." Neil felt nauseous. But he knew. This was his next journey. He contacted Rahul again. At first, Rahul refused. Said he had nightmares, heard things, lost time. But Neil insisted, and this time, they went with a drone, thermal scanners, and a backup camera team. They reached the foothills of Aravalli on a dry, sunless afternoon. Locals avoided the area. One old man, when Neil asked about Bhargava Center, muttered, "It was never a jail. It was a dumping ground for minds that wouldn't bend. If you go, don't speak, don't ask, and above all, don't listen when they call your name." The warning was ominous, but they went anyway. The path was overgrown, the rocks blackened, as if scorched. And then, after 2 hours of climbing, they saw it. A gray concrete structure built into the hill itself, half buried, windows shattered, a gate rusted over and chained 6 times. On the walls, faded red letters in Hindi. "Enter not the mouth of forgotten voices." They broke the chains and stepped inside, and were swallowed by darkness. Their flashlights flickered. The air was dry, but smelled like burnt cloth and something old, something rotten. And from deep within the halls, they heard it, screaming, muffled, constant, rising and falling like a tide of agony. But no one was there. The cells were empty, except the 5th one. Inside sat a man, alive, breathing, covered in dust, eyes white. He looked up at Neil and whispered, "You're late. They're tired of waiting. You promised them justice. Where is it?" Neil backed away, but the man didn't move. Then, without warning, the walls began to pulse. Pipes groaned. The lights exploded. And dozens of screams burst into the air, not through mouths, but through the very concrete of the prison. As if the walls remembered. As if they were still living it. Rahul collapsed, clutching his ears, blood dripping from his nose. Neil screamed too, not out of fear, but from a feeling worse than that. Guilt. Because he had awakened something that could no longer be ignored. He woke up in a hospital 3 days later. Rahul had vanished. The footage was corrupted. The drone crashed midair. But the notebook was beside his bed. And now, the front cover bore a new inscription. Bhargava, judgment pending. He flipped to the back. A blank page. And one sentence slowly appeared, letter by letter, as if written by an unseen hand. "We trusted you." He whispered to the empty room, "I'm not done." The lights in the hospital flickered once, and the whispers faded. But Neil knew. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was a crusade. And he was no longer alone. The doctors said it was exhaustion. The official report labeled it a trauma-induced blackout. But Neil knew better. He hadn't fainted. He'd been silenced. Temporarily. And now, they were watching more closely than ever. Not just the spirits, but someone else. Because as soon as Neil returned home from the hospital, he found an envelope taped to his door. No name. No return address. Inside, a single black and white photograph. A group of men in British-era police uniforms, standing proudly in front of a prison gate. Their faces were scratched out. All but one, Alamgir, standing to the side. Not a prisoner. Wearing the same uniform. Neil stared in disbelief. Was it a mistake? A disguise? Or was Alamgir not who he claimed to be? He flipped the photo. On the back, a single line in red ink. Ask the jailer what happened to the rebels. Below that, coordinates. Not Kalapahad. Not Bhargava. A new place. A name he hadn't seen in the notebook. Tala Devi Camp, Assam Border Forest, Easti 1943. No official record existed. No satellite image showed a structure. But the coordinates pointed to the heart of a restricted forest zone. Neil hesitated. He was tired, afraid, alone. But when he opened the notebook again, new ink began to form. One name, then another, then 10 more. Their ages, their crimes, all the same charge. Sedition, rebellion, silence by order of the jailer. He booked a flight. No crew this time. No Rahul. No backup. Just him, a camera, the notebook, and something cold growing in his chest. The jungle was dense, thick with moisture, its silence louder than city horns. The trees seemed to lean inward, pressing on him as he walked. It took him 5 hours on foot to reach the coordinates. And then he saw it. Concrete buried in moss. A rusted iron gate, half collapsed. Vines growing through shattered glass windows. Above the arch, no name. But below it, carved deeply in stone. Here ends the voice. He stepped in. Inside, rows of narrow cells, far smaller than in Kalapahad or Bhargava. They weren't even large enough to lie down. Some barely large enough to stand. The air smelled like ash and mold. Then he heard it. Not screams. Not whispers. Breathing. Dozens of them. Shallow. Labored. Like people suffocating behind walls. And from one far corner, light. Flickering. Soft. Unnatural. He followed it. To a wide central room. There, a desk. Old. Covered in dust. And behind it, a man in a British-era uniform. Real. Alive. He looked up. His eyes yellowed, his skin sagging. But he was breathing. Still. You came, the man rasped. Neil took a step back. Who are you? The man smiled faintly. I kept them quiet. That was my job. I kept the records. The names. The last words. I was the jailer. Neil's mouth went dry. What are you doing here? I never left, he said simply. No one else wanted the burden. So I stayed. To hold the silence. Neil pulled the notebook from his bag. You erased them. You buried them. And they want justice. The jailer's eyes didn't move from Neil's face. They wanted rebellion. They chose to burn the system. I gave them darkness. Suddenly, the notebook snapped shut in Neil's hands. From all around the room, voices rose, angry, desperate, grief-stricken. The jailer's face twitched. They're awake again, he said. Because you keep calling them. I promised I would, Neil said. The jailer stood. You will regret it. The lights blew out. Total darkness. And from every cell, hundreds of eyes opened, glowing, white, watching. The jailer's scream echoed through the camp. But it wasn't fear. It was rage. And it wasn't directed at Neil. It was directed at the voices. They had broken free. And they had come for him. Neil woke up in daylight, lying outside the camp. His camera broken. The notebook, open beside him, pages blank. Except for one. A single new entry, written in black ink. The jailer has been judged. And beneath it, thank you, Neil. He sat up slowly, body aching, but heart lighter. The forest around him was still. No screams. No breathing. Just wind and sunlight breaking through the trees. For the first time, the silence felt peaceful. He walked away from Tala Devi, knowing that part of the story was finished. But as he stepped onto the road, his phone vibrated. One new message. Unknown number. A single photo. A prison. One he didn't recognize. No coordinates. Just a name. Ashreya Ward, for the cursed. And a caption. They were never prisoners. They were the forgotten experiments. Neil looked up at the sky. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just walked forward. Into the next silence. The road was long, cracked with weeds, cutting through an empty field of dead grass and abandoned watchtowers. Neil walked with the sun behind him, casting a long shadow ahead, as though something unseen walked with him, step for step. Ashreya Ward was a name not even whispered online. No maps. No government listing. No reference in the oldest archives. But Neil didn't need proof anymore. He had the notebook. And now, for the first time since Kalapahad, it wouldn't write by itself. It waited for him. For his hand. His choice. He reached the gate after sunset. It was made of bone-white stone, smeared with black stains. Above it, carved in surgical precision. Ashreya Ward, House of Experiments, Sanctuary of Silence. Sanctuary. He whispered the word. It didn't feel like sanctuary. It felt like the end. Inside, the building was pristine. Clean. White tiles, polished corridors, lights still working. No mold. No rot. No sound. Except music. A faint lullaby, drifting down the hallway like perfume. He followed it. Room after room, all with glass walls. Observation rooms. Each labeled with a patient number. Each empty. Except for the last. Inside was a girl. Maybe 10 years old. Eyes closed. Lying on a bed with wires attached to her head. But she wasn't sleeping. She was mouthing something. Repeating it. Over and over. He leaned closer. Don't wake them. Don't wake them. Don't wake them. Then, suddenly, she stopped. Opened her eyes. And stared directly at him. "Neil," she said. He staggered back. "How do you know me?" She smiled faintly. "They told me you'd come. You opened all the wrong doors." Then her eyes rolled back. And the lullaby stopped. A mechanical voice buzzed through the ceiling. "Containment breach detected. Sector 4. Lights turned red. Doors began to seal." But Neil wasn't running anymore. He turned to the notebook. It was open in his hand. But he hadn't touched it. On the page, written in something that looked like both ink and ash. Ashreya was never a prison. It was a test. They were trying to erase the soul. He ran. Past empty labs, tables with restraints, charts filled with names and numbers. Not names. Subjects. S0112. S0453. S0819. Some were crossed out. Some weren't. The hallway led him to a chamber with a mirrored floor. In the reflection, he saw faces. Children. Women. Old men. All pale. All screaming without sound. Not trapped behind glass. Trapped inside him. And in the center of the room, a chair. Covered in dried straps. And beside it, a file. Marked. Project. and Tacker. He opened it. Inside were documents dated from 1946 to 1971. Reports of surgical experiments. Not on bodies, but on minds. They had been trying to remove emotion, memory, conscience. What remained was something they called the quiet soul. Silent, obedient, empty. In the margins, handwritten notes. Subject 0453 began to weep after extraction. Terminated. Subject 0819 refused to respond. Locked in chamber indefinitely. Subject 0001, name, Alamgir, showed resistance. Sent to Kalapahad. Neil's heart stopped. Alamgir was subject 0001. Not just a revolutionary. Not just a ghost. A prototype. The notebook flipped pages on its own. Wind rushed through the corridor. Lights exploded. The floor cracked beneath him. The faces in the reflection screamed louder, until one by one, they vanished. And in the doorway stood Alamgir, not as a ghost, as a man, eyes dark, body thin, scorched, but alive, still breathing. "You found it," he said softly. Neil stepped back. "You were the first." Alamgir nodded. "They tried to erase what makes us human, not just our rights, our memories, our grief, our joy." He looked around the lab. "They killed thousands here. Why are you still alive?" Neil asked. "Because someone had to remember." He pointed at Neil. "Now it's your turn." Alamgir stepped into the light and vanished, not with a scream, but with silence, a peace that felt final, for him, for now. Neil escaped before the building collapsed. There was no explosion, no fire, just collapse, as if Ashreya Ward had finished its sentence, and was ready to be buried, forever. Back in his apartment, the notebook sat on the table, sealed shut. It hadn't opened in days. He sat beside it, camera off, lights dimmed, and whispered to no one, "I told your stories. I heard your voices. I walked your paths." Then, click. The notebook unlocked. One final page had been added. Not a name, not a place, just a question. "Now, Neil, who will tell yours?" Neil stared at the question on the final page. "Now, Neil, who will tell yours?" His hand hovered over the paper, unsure whether to touch it, fearful that if he did, it might vanish or worse, write something new that he wasn't ready to see. The room around him was quiet. Too quiet. Even the city outside, usually a blur of horns and sirens, seemed to hold its breath. A breeze slipped through the closed window. He didn't move. Instead, he whispered, "Is this how it ends?" But the notebook didn't respond. It just sat there, still, unreadable, waiting. Then, his phone lit up. A message from an unknown number. No name. Just one sentence. "Justice is not a story. It is a chain reaction." Below it, a link. He hesitated, then clicked. A video began to play. It was grainy, black and white security footage, surveillance from an old railway station platform. People waiting, standing, walking. And in the bottom right corner, the date, 1968. Neil squinted, confused, then froze. In the crowd, walking slowly past the camera, was his grandfather. He had seen photos of him growing up, stories told in fragments. His grandfather had been a young union leader, arrested during a protest, disappeared in police custody, never seen again. But in the footage, he was walking with purpose. And then, he turned to the camera, looked directly at it, and smiled, as if he knew Neil would be watching, decades later. The video ended. Neil sat frozen. This was never about Kalapahad, or Bhargava, or even Ashreya Ward. This had always been personal. He opened the notebook again, now trembling. A new section had appeared, pages blank, with only a header on top. The Living Archive. Every story told echoes forward. Every echo becomes a witness. One name appeared, then 2, then 10. Not the dead, not the forgotten, but the descendants. Children, grandchildren, brothers, daughters, people like Neil. People who carried the trauma in their blood without even knowing. People who had dreams that weren't theirs. Nightmares of prisons they had never entered. Memories of voices they never heard, but felt. It wasn't just ghosts that needed justice. It was the living. Neil began to travel. Not to prisons, but to people. He met a woman in Kolkata who still heard footsteps in her sleep, always stopping outside her bedroom door. He spoke to a man in Amritsar who painted the same faceless figure in all his canvases, without ever understanding why. He found a mute child in Bihar who, when handed the notebook, scribbled a map to a forgotten British holding facility, one never recorded in any history. And with each visit, the notebook grew. Not with death, but with memory. The ghosts were no longer bound to prisons. They were stories passed down in silence, waiting to be named, to be known, to be free. and Neil was becoming the keeper of them all. One night, years later, Neil stood before a crowd. The auditorium was full. Young, old, students, skeptics, survivors. Behind him, a screen showed a simple symbol. A chain broken in the center, its broken ends glowing. "This," Neil said, "is not a ghost story. It is a record of injustice buried under generations. It is history you were never allowed to know. And it is still happening." He held up the notebook, now thick, worn, but still alive. "This book is not haunted. It is truthful. And that is far more terrifying." The crowd was silent, moved, and somewhere in the shadows of the back row, he saw them. Not the living. Not anymore. They sat still, eyes calm, shadows flickering only when no one looked directly. Alamgir, the jailer, the girl from Ashreya, even his grandfather, all watching, all listening, not for more justice, not for revenge, but for the story, the truth, finally spoken. That night, after the event, Neil walked alone through the city. He no longer feared the silence. He understood it, carried it, honored it. At a quiet street corner, beneath a flickering street lamp, he paused. The notebook vibrated softly in his bag. He pulled it out. One last message had been written inside. "You told ours. Now live yours. And should you fall silent, someone will continue." For the first time in a long time, Neil smiled and walked forward into a world still full of darkness, but no longer without light. Years passed. Neil's story had spread far and wide, stirring conversations, changing minds, and unearthing truths long buried. Yet the notebook never stopped growing. Every new name, every whispered secret, every hidden injustice was added, like a living chronicle of souls seeking light. One evening, as rain softly tapped against his window, Neil sat alone, the notebook open before him. His fingers traced the worn pages, each scar and stain telling a story of pain and resilience. Suddenly, a shadow moved behind him. He turned slowly. No one was there, but the air was thick with presence. A voice, barely a whisper, filled the room. "Thank you, Neil." He smiled, eyes moist. "Not yet finished," he whispered back. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain. Inside, a new chapter awaited. A story that belonged not just to ghosts or prisoners, but to all who dared to remember. The whisper faded into silence, leaving Neil alone with his thoughts and the ever-growing notebook. Months later, Neil found himself standing at the edge of a dense forest near his hometown, clutching the notebook tightly. He had followed countless leads, but this one felt different. The locals spoke in hushed tones about a place hidden deep within the woods, a place where time seemed to freeze, where echoes of the past lingered like thick fog. As he stepped into the forest, the sunlight dimmed, filtered through twisted branches. The air grew heavy, charged with unseen energy. Each step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was trying to hold him back. Suddenly, the trees parted to reveal a crumbling stone structure half swallowed by vines and moss. The entrance was blocked by a fallen arch, but beyond it, faint lights flickered. Neil's heart pounded. This was it, the next chapter. The next voice waiting to be heard. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing that with every story told, the shadows grew weaker, but the journey was far from over. Neil carefully navigated through the fallen arch, stepping into the remnants of what once was a grand courtyard. The faint flicker of lights came from old lanterns, their flames dancing despite the absence of wind. The silence around him was thick, almost tangible, punctuated only by the distant drip of water echoing through broken walls. The air smelled of damp earth and forgotten memories. As he moved deeper, faded murals on the walls depicted scenes of people, some in chains, others praying or pleading, etched in time yet vivid in emotion. Ahead, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly as if inviting him inside. Neil pushed it open and entered a chamber bathed in a cold, ethereal glow. Shadows clung to the corners, swirling like restless spirits. In the center lay a stone altar, upon which rested an old journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. Neil's fingers trembled as he reached out, opening it to reveal pages filled with delicate handwriting, accounts of those who had suffered here, stories never spoken aloud, voices trapped between the lines. As he read, A presence stirred behind him, a gentle touch on his shoulder. Turning slowly, Neil met the gaze of a woman, her eyes deep pools of sorrow and strength. "You have come," she whispered. Neil nodded, speechless. "Then listen well, for in your hands lies the power to set us free." Neil swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest as he faced the woman. "Who are you?" he finally managed to ask. She smiled softly, though her eyes held the weight of centuries. "I am Asha," she said, "once a prisoner here, bound not by chains, but by silence and forgetfulness. This place was my prison, where hopes were crushed and stories buried." Neil's gaze drifted back to the journal in his hands. "Your story. It's all here." Asha nodded. "Every word you read carries a soul's cry. But these pages alone cannot free us. The truth must be shared. It must live beyond these walls." He felt a surge of determination. "I promise, I will tell your story. I will make sure the world remembers." Asha's figure began to shimmer, fading like mist. "Then go," she whispered, "and carry our voices into the light. Only then will the shadows lift." As she vanished, the chamber filled with a gentle warmth. The heavy silence lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. Neil closed the journal, his purpose clearer than ever. Outside, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting golden light over the ruins. The journey was far from over. But now, hope burned brighter than fear. Days turned into weeks as Neil traveled from town to town, sharing Asha's story alongside the many others he had uncovered. Each telling was met with disbelief, sorrow, and sometimes even hope. The voices of the forgotten began to echo louder, awakening empathy in hearts that had long been closed. One evening, after a talk in a small village, Neil sat beneath a starlit sky, the notebook resting on his lap. The weight of so many lives pressed on him, yet also gave him strength. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "You have done well. But remember, the darkness is never fully gone. It waits in silence, in the forgotten places. Be vigilant, for the stories are endless." Neil looked up at the vast sky, stars twinkling like distant memories. He smiled softly. "Yes," he whispered, "the stories are endless, and so is the fight for justice." He closed the notebook gently, ready to face whatever came next. Years passed, yet Neil's journey never truly ended. The notebook, now thick with countless stories, was both a burden and a blessing, a bridge between the past and the present. One rainy night, as thunder rumbled softly in the distance, Neil sat alone in his study, reflecting on all he had uncovered. The faces of those who had trusted him to carry their truths appeared in his mind's eye. Alamgir, Asha, the silent children of Ashreya Ward, and so many others. A sudden knock at the door broke his reverie. He opened it to find a young woman standing in the rain, eyes bright but filled with a deep sadness. "I've heard your stories," she said quietly, "and I have one of my own." Neil invited her in, knowing that with every new voice, the legacy of the notebook continued. Because some stories never end, they only wait to be told. Neil looked at the young woman sitting across from him, her eyes heavy with untold pain. Slowly, she began to speak. "My name is Mira," she said. "I come from a village where people disappear without reason. Not by police, not by enemies, but by something older, something darker." Neil leaned forward, heart quickening. "They call it the Silent Watcher," Mira continued. "A spirit that claims those who try to speak the truth. I escaped its grasp, but many didn't." As she spoke, the room seemed to grow colder, shadows creeping along the walls as if listening. Neil opened the notebook, already sensing a new chapter was about to be written. "Tell me everything," he urged. And so, beneath the dim light of his study, a new story began. A story that would lead Neil into uncharted darkness, where silence was the deadliest weapon, and the fight for justice was far from over. "Absolutely. I'll expand the story with more detail, depth, and suspense to create a richer, longer narrative. Here's the continuation of the story with an extended, immersive opening for the new chapter with Mira." Neil sat back, the dim light of the study casting long shadows on the walls. Mira's voice was steady but carried the weight of unspeakable fear. "My village, Raghunathpur, is not on any map. It's tucked away deep inside the forests of Jharkhand. For decades, people there have vanished. At first, it was just a few, those who dared to question the local leaders or spoke against ancient superstitions. But then, it became a pattern, a curse. Neil's eyes narrowed, scribbling notes rapidly, his camera running silently beside him. They say the spirit is called Chuppi Rockni Wali, the Silent Watcher. It doesn't make noise, doesn't speak, but it watches. And those it marks, disappear. Mira paused, swallowing hard. Last year, my brother went missing. He was organizing a protest against illegal mining. After he vanished, strange things started happening. People reported seeing a figure standing at the edge of the forest, staring blankly with glowing eyes. Neil leaned closer, feeling the urgency in her words. "Have you seen it?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Once. Near the old banyan tree. It didn't move. Just stood there, watching. I swear. It knew me." Neil glanced toward the notebook. The pages suddenly fluttered, as if caught by an unseen breeze. He opened it carefully, and new lines began to appear, written in hurried, almost frantic handwriting. Raghunathpur. Beware the silent watcher. It feeds on voices, the voices of the brave who refuse to be silenced. The study felt colder. The shadows deepened. Neil's mind raced. This wasn't just another ghost story. It was a legacy, a pattern of fear, control, and unspeakable horror spanning generations. "I need to see this place," he said firmly. Mira's eyes met his. "If you go, don't trust what you hear or see. The Watcher is patient. It waits in silence and in darkness." The next morning, armed with his camera gear and the notebook, Neil set out for Raghunathpur. The journey was grueling, winding through dense forests, muddy paths, and isolated villages where suspicion clung to every face. At the edge of the forest, he stopped. The air was thick with humidity and an eerie stillness that settled deep in his bones. The locals avoided the forest. A few warned him with trembling voices. "Don't go near the banyan tree after sunset. They say the Watcher claims a new soul every full moon." Neil nodded, recording their words, feeling the weight of their fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he made camp near the edge of the forest. Darkness spread quickly here, no city lights to fight the night. Suddenly, a chill swept through the air. The silence was broken by the faintest rustle of leaves. Neil's breath hitched. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the distance, unmoving, unblinking. His heart thundered. He raised the camera. The figure didn't move, just watched. Time seemed to stretch. Then, it vanished, leaving behind only a cold, suffocating silence. For the next 3 days, Neil ventured deeper, documenting every strange occurrence. Inexplicable footsteps, shadows that shifted when unobserved, whispers in the wind that sounded almost like voices calling his name. Each night, he awoke to a sense of being watched, footsteps circling his camp, but never revealing themselves. One night, as the full moon rose high, Neil followed a faint glow deeper into the forest, toward the ancient banyan tree. Under its gnarled roots, he found symbols carved into the bark, ancient runes warning of a curse. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. A cold voice whispered from the shadows, "Speak, and be silent forever." Neil froze. The Watcher appeared, tall, shadowy, its eyes glowing with a terrible light. He raised his voice, defying the silence. "I am here to tell your story." The Watcher's eyes flared, but instead of attacking, it vanished, and the forest exhaled, a long, heavy breath of release. Back at his camp, Neil opened the notebook once more. The pages glowed faintly. New words appeared. The Watcher listens. The silence breaks. The voices grow. Neil smiled, exhausted but resolute. The fight was far from over, but every story told was a step toward freedom. Neil sat by the flickering campfire, the shadows dancing like restless spirits around him. The forest had grown eerily silent after his encounter with the Watcher, but an unsettling tension still hung in the air. He opened the notebook again. The words from earlier seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. The Watcher listens. The silence breaks. The voices grow. Determined to understand more, Neil spent the next morning talking to the villagers. Many remained tight-lipped, fearful of angering the Watcher. But an elderly woman named Dottie, with eyes sharp as a hawk, agreed to speak. "It was long ago," she began, "when the forest first whispered to us. The Watcher was once a guardian, but the greed of men corrupted its soul. Those who dared speak truth were silenced, taken by the Watcher, lost forever." Neil listened closely. "Is there a way to stop it?" Dottie's gaze hardened. "Only if the voices of the lost are heard. If the silence breaks completely, the Watcher will lose its power." Neil nodded, feeling the weight of his mission. That night, he returned to the banyan tree, notebook in hand. As the moonlight bathed the forest in silver, he began to read aloud from the pages, stories of those taken, their names, their fears, their last words. The air around him shimmered. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying faint whispers. Suddenly, from the shadows emerged faint figures, translucent, sorrowful, the lost souls of Raghunathpur. They gathered, listening to Neil's voice, their forms glowing softly. The Watcher appeared again, its eyes less fierce, watching silently. Neil's voice grew stronger, pouring truth and memory into the night. The spirits began to sing, a haunting melody of pain and hope. The Watcher shuddered, then slowly dissolved into the air, releasing a burst of light that filled the forest. The lost were free. Silence was broken. Exhausted but fulfilled, Neil packed his gear. As dawn broke, he took one last look at the forest, now peaceful, alive with birdsong and light. He knew this story was just one among many, but it was a victory. A reminder that even in the darkest places, voices matter. And that sometimes, courage means breaking the silence. As Neil turned to leave the now peaceful forest of Raghunathpur, a sudden chill swept over him, different from the oppressive cold of before. It was lighter, but insistent, like a gentle hand on his shoulder. He stopped and looked around. From the corner of his eye, a faint shimmer appeared, a figure, barely visible in the morning light. It was Mira. She smiled softly, eyes reflecting hope and sorrow intertwined. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have given us a voice." Neil nodded, feeling the weight of countless stories he'd carried so far, and the many still waiting. Before disappearing into the trees, Mira added, "There are more like us. More stories. More silence that needs breaking." Neil took a deep breath, clutching the notebook tightly. His journey was far from over. Because in the shadows of forgotten places, in the corners of untold histories, the next story was always waiting. And he would be there to tell it. The sun rose higher, bathing the world in golden light. Neil walked forward, ready to face whatever darkness came next. Neil stepped back onto the dusty village path, the early morning sun casting long shadows behind him. The weight of the notebook in his bag felt heavier than ever, not just with stories of pain and fear, but with a newfound purpose and hope. As he walked toward the distant highway that would take him to the next town, his phone buzzed with a message. "The silence is breaking faster than you think. Watch the skies. A friend." He glanced up. The sky was clear, but far on the horizon, dark clouds were gathering, slowly swirling in unnatural patterns. Neil's breath caught. The journey to uncover the forgotten was far from over. Somewhere out there, beyond the forests and ruins, a new story was unfolding. A story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fear, silence, and courage. And this time, the stakes would be higher than ever. Absolutely. I'll expand this next part into a longer, detailed narrative filled with suspense, atmosphere, and emotional depth. Here's an extended continuation of Neil's journey after leaving Raghunathpur. Neil walked steadily along the cracked dirt road, the sun now high above, burning away the last remnants of morning mist. The villagers' faces lingered in his mind, some hopeful, others haunted. Mira's words echoed quietly in his ears. "There are more like us. More stories. More silence that needs breaking." The notebook in his bag felt like a living entity. The leather cover, worn and cracked, had absorbed the weight of countless lives, countless untold voices. Every step Neil took seemed to reverberate with the silent cries of the past. Ahead, the road stretched out toward a small town on the edge of a vast, abandoned industrial complex, a place the locals whispered about with fear, Matry Mills. Once a thriving textile factory during the colonial era, It had shut down abruptly in the late 1970s. Rumors of accidents, poisonings, and mysterious disappearances surrounded it. Some said the factory had been a front for darker experiments, human laborers trapped and exploited beyond any law. Neil's contacts had flagged Matry Mills as a potential site tied to recent unexplained phenomena. Strange noises at night, shadowy figures seen lurking near the ruins, and locals vanishing without a trace. His heart quickened as he approached the town's outskirts. The buildings grew sparse, abandoned shops with shattered windows staring like empty eye sockets. The air smelled of rust and decay. He stopped at a roadside chai stall, sipping tea while listening carefully to the hushed whispers of the locals. Most averted their eyes, afraid to talk. But an old man, his skin weathered and eyes sharp, leaned closer. "They say the factory's curse started when the owner disappeared," he murmured. Right after that, workers began vanishing. Not just leaving, disappearing. Some say their souls were trapped inside those walls. Neil nodded, making mental notes. That night, armed with only a flashlight, camera, and the ever-present notebook, he slipped past the rusted gates of Matry Mills. Inside, the factory was a labyrinth of broken machinery, tangled wires, and thick layers of dust. The air was stale, heavy with a metallic scent that stung his throat. Each step echoed, the silence pressing on him like a living thing. Suddenly, a low hum began, a sound like distant machinery starting up. The floor vibrated subtly beneath his feet. He followed the hum deeper into the building, toward the central chamber, where massive looms once clattered day and night. As he entered, the lights flickered unexpectedly, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. In one corner, a faded mural showed workers, faces blurred, hands outstretched, some reaching for freedom, others caught in invisible chains. Then, through the gloom, a figure appeared. A woman. Her clothes torn, face pale, eyes wide with fear. She didn't speak. Instead, she pointed toward a narrow corridor, her gaze pleading. Neil hesitated but followed. The corridor ended at a sealed door, marked only by a rusted sign. Quarantine, authorized personnel only. His heart pounded as he forced the door open. Inside was a small room, lined with glass observation windows and empty beds. On the floor, scattered papers detailed experiments, chemical tests, psychological evaluations, notes about subjects who had suffered neurological damage. Among the documents was a journal, pages yellowed but filled with desperate entries. One line stood out. The workers who resisted were kept here. Their minds fractured, voices stolen. Suddenly, the air shifted. Whispers filled the room, disjointed voices, crying out in pain and anger. The woman appeared again, closer now. She reached out. Neil took her hand, and was flooded with visions. Faces trapped behind invisible walls, silent screams, days stretching into endless nights. When the visions faded, the woman smiled, a brief, bittersweet smile, and vanished. Neil sank to the floor, breathless. He opened the notebook. New words formed on the page. Matry Mills, where silence became a prison, where justice must be forged from truth. He realized the fight was far from over. The night stretched on, heavy with secrets. Neil knew he would return, to uncover the truth, to give voice to the voiceless, to break the silence. Because some stories refuse to die. Neil stayed awake long after the first light of dawn touched the crumbling walls of Matry Mills. His mind raced with fragments of the visions, faces etched with desperation, the silent cries trapped inside the factory's walls. The woman's eyes haunted him, reflecting a sorrow so deep it was almost tangible. He packed his equipment silently, careful not to disturb the fragile peace settling over the ruins. Outside, the village was waking, life stirring slowly, unaware of the horrors lurking just beyond. As he walked back through the deserted streets, Neil's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You've seen the first veil lifted. The next will be darker. Trust no one." A chill ran down his spine. Who was watching him? And how many were involved in this dark web of silence? Determined, Neil began reaching out to locals, former workers, descendants, anyone with a memory tied to Matry Mills. Slowly, a picture emerged. Stories of forced labor, disappearances, and a shadowy figure known only as the Overseer. According to whispers, the Overseer was more than a man. Some said he was possessed, an agent of something far darker than mere greed or cruelty. He was the one who ensured silence reigned, by any means necessary. One evening, an elderly man handed Neil a rusted key and whispered, "This opens the overseer's office. But beware, once inside, the truth won't let you go." Heart-pounding, Neil accepted the key, feeling the weight of the unseen eyes watching his every move. That night, under a blanket of stars, he returned to the factory, stepping through shadows thicker than ever. The door creaked open. Inside, the office was frozen in time. Papers scattered, a half-empty glass of whiskey, and an old typewriter. But as Neil approached, the typewriter began to clatter on its own. Words appeared on the paper, slowly at first, then with growing urgency. "You cannot silence the truth forever." The lights flickered violently. From the dark corners of the room, whispers rose into a chorus. Neil's breath hitched. Then, silence. The notebook glowed softly in his hand. A new entry appeared. "The overseer's shadow looms large. But even shadows can be broken by light." Neil knew his fight was just beginning. He steeled himself. The story demanded justice, and he would not stop until every silence was shattered. Neil stood motionless as the last words faded from the typewriter. The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows that seemed to dance, twisting into shapes that teased the edges of his vision. His fingers trembled, clutching the notebook tightly. The air around him grew colder, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down. He felt a presence, not hostile, but watchful. Suddenly, a soft, distant whisper floated through the room. "Seek the truth buried beneath the ashes." Neil's mind raced. Beneath the ashes. The factory had burned down decades ago. Rumors spoke of a fire, sudden and mysterious, that engulfed part of the complex, destroying records and silencing many witnesses. He realized that the answers he sought were not in the office. They were buried beneath the ruins of that fire. Determined, Neil pocketed the notebook and stepped outside. The moon hung high, illuminating the blackened remains of the factory's old textile shed. Twisted metal and charred beams jutted upward like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. He crossed the debris carefully, the crunch of broken glass and burnt wood loud in the stillness. At the center lay a collapsed pit, once a basement storage room, now an open maw filled with ash and rubble. Neil took a deep breath and began digging through the ashes with his bare hands, driven by a desperate need to uncover what had been hidden. Hours passed, the chill of the night sinking deeper into his bones. Finally, his fingers brushed against something solid, a rusted metal box, locked but intact. He pulled it free, heart pounding. With a nearby rock, he pried the box open. Inside were yellowed papers, photographs, and a small, leather-bound diary. The photographs showed faces, workers, men and women, some smiling, others gaunt and tired. Many were marked with red XS. The diary belonged to a young woman named Kavita, a worker and secret chronicler of the factory's darkest days. Neil flipped through the pages, her words painting a haunting picture. They took the brave ones first, those who dared to speak out, to organize. The overseer was merciless, but we wrote in secret. We kept hope alive through our words. As dawn broke, Neil knew what he must do. The stories buried beneath the ashes would be brought to light. Because the truth, no matter how deeply hidden, would never stay silent forever. Neil spent the early morning hours carefully photographing Kavita's diary and the faded photographs. Each page revealed the unbearable reality of the factory workers' suffering. Long hours, brutal punishments, and the silent, creeping terror of the overseer's wrath. Yet woven through the pain was a thread of resistance, small acts of courage passed down in secret writings and whispered songs. As he closed the diary, a sudden sound startled him, a faint rustling from the shadows nearby. He froze. From the darkness emerged an old man, his face lined with years of hardship, but eyes burning with fierce determination. "You found the truth," the man said quietly. Neil nodded, heart pounding. "Who are you?" "I am Raghav," the man replied, "son of one of those workers. I have spent my life searching for proof, for justice. Kavita's diary was our only hope." Raghav extended a hand, weathered but steady. "Together, we can finally tell their story." Neil felt a surge of resolve. The fight was no longer his alone. With Raghav's help, they planned to expose the factory's dark past to the world, to shatter the silence that had held generations captive. Days later, Neil stood before a packed crowd in the nearby town hall, diary and photographs in hand. As he recounted the stories of Matry Mills, the room was silent, absorbed, haunted, transformed. At that moment, Neil understood something profound. Stories are not just memories. They are weapons. They are light. They are freedom. And as the final words left his lips, a hush fell over the hall, a silence no longer of fear, but of reverence. Outside, the wind carried a new promise. The past would no longer be buried. The future belonged to those brave enough to speak. Years later, Neil found himself sitting in a quiet room, the soft hum of a recorder filling the space. He was being interviewed for a documentary about his journey, about the stories he had uncovered and the voices he had given back to the forgotten. As he spoke, he glanced down at the now thick notebook resting on his lap. It was no longer just a book. It was a legacy, a testament to the power of truth and courage. But even as he shared his tale, Neil knew the fight was never truly over. There were still shadows lurking in places unseen, still silences waiting to be broken. And as long as there were stories left untold, he would be ready. Because the notebook had taught him one thing: every story matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. And in the end, light always finds a way to break through the darkness.